Random Access Mayhem, or RAM for short, is a game that's currently in development, and right now, it's my most anticipated game. After thoroughly playing through the game's demo several times, I would like to give my opinions on what the game does right, and where the game currently stands to improve. RAM, more than anything right now, is a game that knows how to be fun. The gameplay is fast and frantic, and if you want to play at proficiency, you have to be able to play with multiple different playstyles. This keeps the game fun, and it keeps it from being stale. The central gimmick of the game is that there's no player character. Kind of. You see, instead of having a player character, what you're doing is swapping between various enemies that you take control of. And in case you were considering just keeping the same host or the same type of host throughout the entire game, good luck with that, because the game intelligently adapts to who you're picking the most, and it prevents you from getting upgrades for that host, leaving them in the dust as the game gets harder. This prevents a dominant strategy from forming, and prevents the player from optimizing the fun out of the game. In addition to this, designing the enemies to be playable is a double-edged sword, in a good way. Now you might think that designing characters to be both playable and enemies would make them worse at both aspects because you have to sacrifice parts of them to make them better in the other areas. But you'd be wrong. I don't think I've played a game with as engaging enemies as RAM in a long time. I think the fact they have to be designed to be playable is a big part of this. Let's for a moment take a look at enemies in a more generic game. You might have Basic Goblin, who is just an enemy that's bad at everything. You might have the Orc, which is just the basic goblin but with more health and more damage. You might have the Projectile Wizard enemy. You might have the annoying spider that goes really fast. Now let's compare that to the enemies in Random Access Mayhem. We have the incredibly fast Grenadier who has trouble changing directions while moving. We have the shotgun enemy who will release an absolute tidal wave of pellets towards you. We have the Flame Spewer who will leave a sticky trail of death behind himself randomly. And we have the Brawler who will grapple onto you, enemies, or explosive barrels just to get to you. You see, the difference between RAM's enemies and the more generic ones I mentioned earlier is that RAM's enemies are three-dimensional. Much like a certain ogre, they have layers. The fact that the tanky Brawler has a grappling hook, or the fact that the grenade enemy also goes really fast, changes the way you approach fighting them. But now that I've talked at length about how it feels to fight these enemies, let's talk about how it feels to play as them. The shotgun robot, or as I like to call him, John Ultrakill, because he has the ability to punch his own bullets to make them go faster and harder, is currently, I believe, the game's best balanced robot. He has a very good and consistent source of damage in terms of the shotgun, which can absolutely melt enemies at close range and pick them off very efficiently at longer ranges. He also has a good defensive option in terms of his reflectability. But all of this is balanced by how much mobility he lacks. If you're not careful, you will get cornered as this guy and take a lot of punishment. The Aphid, or as I like to call him, Pyro TF2, is also a really good robot. In fact, he might be a little too good. As far as I'm concerned, the only problem with the Aphid is that there are no problems with the Aphid. The flamethrower can demolish groups of enemies pretty quickly in this game. The flammable sticky goo traps also give him an amazing defensive option if he finds himself in a small enclosed area. And most of the time, if he ever finds himself in any trouble, he can just jet out of there as soon as possible. While he is personally my favorite robot, I do think he could use a nerf. Moving on to Mr. Hit and Run himself, we have, whatever the grenade enemy is called, I forgot. Well, the grenade enemy seems a little awkward to control at first. Once you figure out the ropes, he quickly becomes a very fun and engaging character to play as. He has amazing mobility tools that can make you just feel completely untouchable on the battlefield if you're good enough with them. His grenade mechanics allow him to be both good at single target and group damage at the same time. But he is balanced by the fact he has terrible defensive options. If you do not have the room to run away, well then you don't have the room to run away and you'll find yourself getting obliterated pretty fast. In fact, currently that's my only problem with him. Sometimes you get obliterated too fast. His health pool is so low that sometimes I'll get one shot as this character. And getting one shot just never feels satisfying because you think you have the safety of your health bar, but it turns out you didn't. You got one shot. Too bad. Moving on, we have the Deadlift, who I currently think is the most flawed character in the game. But this is Ram we're talking about, so the worst character in the game is still really good. You see, Deadlift is kind of a brick wall right now. He has a lot of health, he has really good defenses because he can slap away projectiles, but he does not do very good damage at all. His weak little slaps are completely pitiful, and even a fully charged hit doesn't do nearly the same amount of damage as a single shotgun burst, despite taking a lot longer to charge up. And considering that he doesn't have the best mobility either, I really think he should be doing more damage than he does currently. Right now, I do think he's fine to use, but he really needs upgrades more than any other character in the game. In fact, sometimes I even think he suffers from Kingdom Hearts syndrome, also known as, oh my gosh, why isn't that standard? Why did you make that an upgrade? You should have that at the beginning of the game. Why is that an upgrade? Specifically, the grappler should really stun enemies that you grapple onto by default. It really sucks to grapple onto a shotgun enemy only to have them remove half your health bar as soon as you get them close to you. I'd also retain some movement when charging, but that's more of a personal preference thing. Now that I've gushed over the game and talked about each of its playable characters that exist currently in the game, I would like to talk about what I think could be improved currently. Okay, so right away, the game's too hard. Now, I have beaten Doom Eternal on Nightmare difficulty, and I have gone through all of Ultra Kill as it exists currently on Violence. So believe me, I have my gamer card. I've developed games before, and believe me, this is a common issue. As a game developer, you tend to not notice how hard your game actually is, because by virtue of developing the game, you're better than 95% of other players out there. That's right, I'm a game developer, and you're currently being lectured on game design by the creator of Catastrophe. Let me tell you, the name is very accurate. This was made for a game jam. There's more art in the actual version, I promise. Oh my gosh. Now the good thing is that this problem does not have a complicated fix at all, because there's already an easier mode in the game. And I believe this difficulty is really well designed for beginners, who, let's face it, are generally the real target audience for the normal mode in video games. It also helps that they wouldn't have to check the I'm a nerd box in the menu. My second major complaint is something I alluded to earlier when I talked about Mr. Rolly Guy, and that's that sometimes you'll just get one shot, and that never feels fair. Now, to be honest, I don't know if I'm actually getting one shot or if two enemies are just attacking me at the exact same time, but the effect is still the same. Having a low health bar is one of the best incentives for character swapping, but if your low health bar is just as susceptible to getting killed as your high health bar is, then it feels like what was the point of switching characters in the first place? And that brings me on to my next big criticism, and this is a really big one, that swapping characters often does not feel emphasized nearly as much as it should. Yeah, sure, if you switch bots less, then you'll get lower credits to spend in the shop. But the shop always appears at the midway point throughout the levels, and doesn't appear again. So realistically, if you want to play optimally, you can switch off and on to different robots for the first half, get all the best items from the shop, and then hug one or two robots for the rest of the game, because there's no real downside to doing that. The shop also just generally feels underwhelming. It's just more upgrades, half of which aren't even going to work with the builds I'm using. And do I really want to roll for a random upgrade if it can completely ruin the playstyle I'm using? And hugging 2 robots is a strategy that is just too effective currently in the game. You can completely just ignore some of the robots completely if you really want to, just focus on 3 of them, or 2. I think there needs to be another outside influence to get people to switch to robots, and I have an idea for it. Imagine if every so often as you were playing, a robot would appear with, let's say, a glowing symbol above their head, and that symbol means if you switch to that robot right now, you would get all sorts of different boosts. Maybe it could be extra damage, extra speed, extra health. That would make people actually consider switching to robots they don't like. I mean, sure, I don't really like Deadlift, but if switching to him means I get double damage for 15 seconds, then I guess I'll switch. And back to the topic of upgrades, I think a problem right now is that there's really no defensive-based upgrades. There's no way for you to really increase your resistance to taking damage. So as you go through the game, you just get glassier and you get cannonier. Just, you can deal out a lot of damage, but you'll die in like fractions of seconds. And ironically, oftentimes giving players less defensive options makes them play more defensively. They'll tend to stay further away from direct combat and only take on 1v1s, because they know they don't have the health cushion required to take on bigger, more challenging foes. Take Soldier versus Sniper for an example. Soldier has a lot more health and has the ability to get out of tough situations with rocket jumps. Meanwhile, Sniper has terrible health, terrible speed, and no way to get out of a sticky situation. And guess who's the class that plays more defensively and passively? And I understand that as a developer, this is really a rock and a hard place type scenario, because naturally people will want health and defensive upgrades. But also naturally, getting more health will cause people to switch different robots less. And that's the point of the game. But as Neelix from Star Trek Voyager once said, when the road before you splits in 2, take the 3rd path. My idea is that we tie defensive upgrades to switching. Imagine, say, if switching gave you a temporary overheal that drained over time. This would fix several issues with the game at once. It would add defensive upgrades, it would encourage players to switch more often, and it would also fix the one-shotting issue I mentioned earlier by making it feel like the player's fault. Oh, you got one shot? Well, that wouldn't have happened if you're switching more often like you're supposed to. This would also help because the trade-off for switching characters is oftentimes just really not worth it at the moment. You're giving up basically 50% of your bonus health to what look kind of cooler sometimes. This would also help facilitate more aggressive playstyles because you'd want to regain your the switch boost energy, I guess it's called. And you naturally want to try to do everything quicker, because that safety net you're relying on is on a timer. Anyways, that's about all I have to say for this section of the video. Please keep in mind my intention for this section was constructive criticism. I think criticizing a game before release is the most important time to criticize it, because technically everything I've said isn't a flaw with the game yet, because the game's not out. There are potential flaws that can be fixed. And overall, this is a really fun game. I have a lot of good times playing. In fact, that's my only other criticism I have with the game right now. If anything, right now, the demo is too good. I've replayed the demo several times over at this point. The demo's so good, some people might not even want to play the whole game. Anyways, that about wraps up this video. The game's really good. You could check it out, and also check out the subscribe button while you're at it, you know? Maybe do that.